Richard Chen never thought October 15th would become the day that changed everything. He was sitting in a conference room at the Shangri-La Hotel in Singapore, watching lawyers shuffle papers and executives check their watches. The merger meeting that was supposed to seal a $2.3 billion deal had just been postponed. Regulatory complications, they called it. Technical jargon for government red tape that would take another week to sort out. Richard felt his shoulders relax for the first time in days. He'd been working 18-hour days for 3 months straight to make this deal happen. Now suddenly he had time, an entire weekend he hadn't expected to have. He pulled out his phone and stared at the screen. His wife Isabella didn't know he was coming home early. She thought he'd be gone until Friday. A smile crossed his face as he imagined her surprise. After 28 years of marriage, he still loved catching her off guard. Maybe they could have dinner at that little Italian place where they had their first date. Maybe they could just stay in and talk like they used to. The flight back to California felt longer than usual. Richard couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about Isabella, about how patient she'd been through all these years of him building his company from nothing. Back when they were in college, they'd shared a tiny apartment with furniture from garage sales. She'd believed in him when he was just a kid with big dreams and no money. She'd stood by him through every failure, every setback, every long night when he thought about giving up. Now they had everything. The mansion in one of California's most expensive neighborhoods. Cars that cost more than most people's houses. A company that employed thousands of people. But somewhere along the way, he'd forgotten to slow down. He'd forgotten that success meant nothing if you couldn't share it with the people you love. When the plane touched down at San Francisco International, Richard felt a nervous excitement he hadn't experienced in years. It reminded him of being young again, of the butterflies he'd get before picking Isabella up for dates. He told his driver and security team they could take the rest of the day off. He wanted to drive himself home, to keep this moment private and personal. The October afternoon was perfect. Bright sun, clear blue sky, just a hint of coolness in the air. Richard drove through the familiar streets of Atherton, past houses hidden behind tall hedges and iron gates. Each property worth tens of millions of dollars. Each one a fortress of privacy. His own estate sat on 2 acres at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. He pulled up to the electronic gates and punched in his code. The gates swung open smoothly and he drove up the long driveway lined with oak trees. The house looked peaceful, quiet. Isabella's car was parked in front of the garage, so he knew she was home. It was 2 in the afternoon on a Wednesday. She'd probably be reading in the sunroom or working on her charity foundation paperwork. Richard parked and grabbed his briefcase. He decided to use the side entrance instead of the front door. It felt more casual, more like the old days when they lived in that tiny apartment and he'd come home from his programming job. He unlocked the door as quietly as he could, wanting to maintain the element of surprise. The house was silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Richard set down his briefcase and loosened his tie. The marble floors made it easy to move quietly in his dress shoes. He wondered where Isabella was. Usually she played music when she was home alone. Classical piano or old jazz recordings. But today there was nothing. Then he heard voices, faint at first, coming from somewhere toward the back of the house. Isabella's voice, light and laughing. And another voice. A man's voice. Deep, confident, unfamiliar. Richard felt his heart start to beat faster. They had staff that came during the day sometimes. The gardener, the pool maintenance guy, delivery people. But something about the tone of the conversation felt wrong. Too casual, too comfortable. And it was coming from his private study, the room where he kept his most important documents and computers. He moved down the hallway, his footsteps silent on the thick carpet runner. The study door was partially open, just a crack. Enough to see inside but not be seen. Richard stopped a few feet away and listened. His mouth went dry. The offshore accounts in the Caymans have been completely cleared out, the man's voice said. It was smooth, professional, like someone discussing a business transaction. We followed the plan exactly. Once the Singapore deal finalizes, we can move on the rest. He'll have no idea until it's far too late. Richard felt the world tilt sideways. He pressed his hand against the wall to steady himself. This couldn't be happening. This couldn't be real. Isabella's voice came next, and it was like listening to a stranger. 28 years, she said, and there was no warmth in her tone. Just cold calculation. 28 years I've played the perfect wife. Smiled for every camera, attended every boring dinner party, pretended to care about his stupid technology company. Well, I'm done pretending. Half his fortune isn't enough. Not after what I've given up. I want everything. Richard's legs felt weak. He leaned against the doorframe, afraid he might collapse. The woman speaking was Isabella. Her voice, her laugh. But the words coming out of her mouth belonged to someone he'd never met. Someone who'd been living in his house, sleeping in his bed, lying to his face for years. Your cousin came through perfectly, the man said. The documentation is flawless. The shell corporations are untraceable. By the time his lawyers figure out what happened, we'll be in a country with no extradition treaty. The money will be clean and we'll be free. Richard forced himself to peek through the crack in the door. Isabella sat at his desk, his personal laptop open in front of her. Next to her stood a man Richard had never seen before. Younger than Richard, maybe in his mid-30s. Expensive suit, dark hair. He had his hand on Isabella's shoulder in a way that was far too familiar. Far too intimate. Papers were spread across the desk. Richard recognized some of them. Bank statements. Account numbers. Legal documents with his signature. Except he'd never signed those documents. He'd never authorized those transfers. His whole body started shaking. Rage and heartbreak fought for control inside his chest. Every instinct screamed at him to burst through that door. To confront them. To demand answers. But years of business negotiations had taught him something valuable. Never make a move when you're emotional. Never show your hand until you're ready to play it. Richard backed away from the door as quietly as he'd approached. His mind was racing, jumping from thought to thought like a pinball machine. How long had this been going on? How much had they taken? Who was this man? What else had Isabella lied about? He made it back to the side entrance and slipped outside. The bright October sunshine felt wrong now. Too cheerful for a day when his entire life had just been revealed as a lie. He walked to his car in a daze, got in and drove away from his house without any destination in mind. 2 blocks away, he pulled over and just sat there, gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. The woman he'd loved since he was 22 years old had been systematically destroying him. And she'd been doing it with a smile on her face. Richard sat in his car for what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes. His hands were still shaking. His mind kept replaying what he'd heard. Isabella's voice, cold and calculating, talking about stealing everything he'd built, the stranger's hand on her shoulder. The laptop open with all his private information exposed like an open wound. He needed to think clearly. He needed a plan. But right now all he felt was the crushing weight of betrayal pressing down on his chest, making it hard to breathe. Finally, he picked up his phone. There was only one person he could call right now. Only one person in his entire life who he trusted completely, who had never let him down, who had proven their loyalty 1,000 times over. Patricia Wong answered on the second ring. She'd been his chief legal officer for 15 years, had helped him navigate every major decision, every crisis, every challenge. Her voice was calm and professional as always. Richard, I thought you were in Singapore until Friday. Patricia, I need you. His voice cracked. Something's happened. Something bad. Can you meet me? Somewhere private. Somewhere nobody would think to look. There was a pause. Then Patricia's voice shifted, becoming urgent. Where are you? Are you safe? I'm safe. Physically, anyway. He gave her the address of a coffee shop in Palo Alto, far enough from his usual haunts that nobody would recognize him. Can you bring David too? I'm going to need legal help. Serious legal help. I'll have him there in an hour. Richard, what's going on? I'll explain when I see you. Just trust me. And Patricia, don't tell anyone. Not your assistant, not anyone from the office. Nobody can know about this meeting. He drove to the coffee shop and sat in a back corner booth, baseball cap pulled low, sunglasses on even though he was indoors. He ordered coffee he didn't drink and stared at the table. Every few minutes his phone buzzed with messages from Isabella. When does your flight land? Can't wait to see you Friday. Love you. Each message felt like a knife twisting in his gut. Patricia arrived first, her face tight with concern. She slid into the booth across from him. Talk to me. The whole story came pouring out. Coming home early. The voices in his study. Isabella and the stranger discussing offshore. Accounts and shell corporations. The plan to take everything once the Singapore deal went through. Patricia's face grew darker with each detail. "My God," she whispered when he finished. "Richard, do you have any proof? Any recordings? Anything we can use?" "Just what I heard. I didn't think to record it. I just ran. I couldn't stay there another second." David Rothstein arrived 10 minutes later, Richard's personal attorney for the past decade. He was a sharp man with silver hair and eyes that missed nothing. When Richard repeated the story, David pulled out a legal pad and started taking notes. "Here's what we know," David said, tapping his pen against the paper. "Your wife has access to your accounts. You gave her power of attorney years ago, right?" Richard nodded. "For convenience. When I travel, I never thought she'd use it to steal from me." "That's going to complicate things," David said. "Legally, if she has power of attorney, some of these transfers might not technically be theft. We need to see exactly what she's moved and how she's moved it." Patricia leaned forward. "We need a forensic accountant, someone who can trace every penny, find every hidden account, document everything. And we need to do it fast before they realize Richard knows." "I know someone," David said. "Dr. Helen Park, best forensic accountant in the state. She's worked on corporate fraud cases, divorce cases, everything. If there's money hidden somewhere, she'll find it." "Get her," Richard said. "Money is no object. I need to know exactly what Isabella's done." Over the next 3 days, Richard lived in a strange kind of hell. He checked into a hotel under a fake name and told Isabella through text messages that the Singapore deal was taking longer than expected. He posted photos on social media that his team helped stage, making it look like he was still overseas. Meanwhile, Patricia, David, and Dr. Park worked around the clock. What they found made Richard physically sick. Dr. Park spread the documents across the conference table in David's office. "It's sophisticated," she said. "Very sophisticated. Whoever planned this knew exactly what they were doing. The numbers were staggering. Over the past 3 years, Isabella had siphoned off $340 million. She'd used Richard's digital signatures, forged on dozens of documents. She'd created shell corporations in 5 different countries. She'd moved money through so many accounts that it looked like legitimate business transactions. She's been planning this for years," Patricia said, her voice filled with disgust. This wasn't impulsive. This was calculated. But the worst discovery was still to come. Dr. Park pulled up a photograph on her laptop. "I found something else. I traced some of the money to Prague. It's going to a woman named Maria Novak, single mother, 1 child. A 3-year-old boy." Richard stared at the photo, a young woman holding a little boy with dark hair and dark eyes. "Who is she?" "I did some digging," Patricia said quietly. "That man you saw with Isabella? His name is Victor Novak. He's Maria's brother. And Richard, I'm sorry, but we ran a background check. Victor and Isabella have been seen together for at least 5 years. In Prague, in Paris, in London. Always when you were traveling for business, the room spun. Are you saying what I think you're saying?" Dr. Park nodded slowly. "We got DNA results back. I managed to obtain a sample through some contacts. The child is Victor's, and given the timeline and the money trail, we believe Isabella might be the mother." Richard stood up so fast his chair fell over. "That's impossible. Isabella can't have children. We tried for years after our kids were born. The doctor said it was unlikely she'd ever get pregnant again. The medical records show she had a pregnancy 5 years ago," Patricia said gently. "Hidden medical records. A private clinic in Switzerland. She had the baby there and gave him to Victor's sister to raise. The money you've been losing? A lot of it has been going to support that child." Richard walked to the window and pressed his forehead against the cold glass. 28 years of marriage. 2 adult children together. A whole life built on what he thought was love and trust. And all of it had been a lie, not just for 3 years, but for at least 5. "Maybe longer. There's more," David said. "Victor Novak is wanted in 2 countries for financial fraud. He's an expert at identity theft and money laundering. We believe Isabella met him about 6 years ago at a charity event in Europe. They've been planning this ever since. They're waiting for the Singapore deal," Richard said, his voice hollow. "Once those billions hit my accounts, they'll drain everything and disappear." Patricia came to stand beside him. "Then we don't let them. We build an airtight case. We document everything. And when the time is right, we take them down so hard they never see freedom again." Richard turned to look at her. "I have to go back home. I have to pretend like nothing's wrong. Can I do that?" Can I sit across from her at dinner and act like I don't know she's been destroying me? You're one of the toughest people I know, Patricia said. You built a billion-dollar company from nothing. You've survived hostile takeovers and market crashes. You can do this. For a little while longer. Until we're ready, Richard nodded slowly. He felt something cold settling into his chest. Not just anger, though there was plenty of that. Not just heartbreak, though his heart felt like it had been shattered into a million pieces. It was something harder, more focused determination. Isabella thought she'd won. She thought he was blind and stupid and too trusting to ever catch on. She'd underestimated him. They both had. And that was going to be their biggest mistake. Friday evening came faster than Richard wanted. He stood in the airport bathroom, staring at his reflection in the mirror. He'd been gone for 6 days. In that time, his entire world had been turned upside down. Now he had to walk back into his house and pretend like nothing had changed. He had to look his wife in the eyes and act like he didn't know she'd been planning to destroy him. He practiced his smile. It looked fake. He tried again. Still fake. Finally, he just took a deep breath and walked out. He'd survived countless high-pressure business negotiations. He could survive this. The driver picked him up from the airport and made small talk about the weather during the drive home. Richard barely heard him. His mind was going over the plan Patricia and David had laid out. Stay calm, act normal. Let Isabella think everything was fine. Meanwhile, Dr. Park would keep digging, finding every hidden dollar, building an unbreakable case. When the car pulled up to his house, Isabella was waiting at the front door. She wore a blue dress he'd bought her last Christmas. Her smile was bright and welcoming. She looked exactly like the woman he'd fallen in love with all those years ago. It made what he knew even harder to bear. Welcome home. She threw her arms around him and kissed his cheek. Richard forced himself not to pull away. He hugged her back, breathing in her familiar perfume, trying not to think about her with Victor. Trying not to think about the child she'd hidden from him. It's good to be back, he said, and he was amazed at how normal his voice sounded. That deal was exhausting. Nothing but meetings and lawyers for days. Well, you're home now, Isabella said, linking her arm through his. I made reservations at Enzo's for dinner. Your favorite. We have so much to catch up on. That night at dinner, Richard watched her like she was a stranger. She talked about her charity foundation's upcoming gala. She mentioned that their daughter Jennifer had called about Thanksgiving plans. She asked about Singapore and listened with what seemed like genuine interest as he described the delayed merger. And the whole time, all Richard could think was how good she was at this, how perfectly she played the role of loving wife. How many times had she sat across from him like this, smiling and nodding, while secretly planning to take everything? How many times had she kissed him goodbye before getting on a plane to meet Victor? You seem distracted, Isabella said, reaching across the table to touch his hand. Is everything okay? Richard snapped back to the present. Just tired. It was a long week. Well, tomorrow's Saturday. You can sleep in, relax by the pool. Maybe we can watch a movie like we used to. She squeezed his hand. I've missed you. The words felt like acid in his ears. But he smiled and squeezed back. I've missed you too. Over the next 2 weeks, Richard lived a double life. During the day, he went to work, attended meetings, acted like everything was normal. He even moved forward with the Singapore deal, signing papers and transferring funds. But every move he made was calculated. Every account he touched, he'd already emptied and moved to new secure locations that Isabella didn't know about. At night, he came home to Isabella. They had dinner together. They watched television. They talked about their kids and their plans for the holidays. And the whole time, Richard felt like he was walking on a tightrope, one wrong word away from falling. Meanwhile, Patricia's team was working in the shadows. Dr. Park had uncovered more hidden accounts. She'd found email chains between Isabella and Victor going back 6 years. She'd discovered that they'd been lovers long before Richard had suspected, meeting in hotel rooms across Europe and Asia whenever Richard was traveling for business. The hardest part was the evidence about the child. Dr. Park had confirmed, through DNA testing, that Isabella was indeed the mother. She'd hidden the pregnancy completely, claiming she was visiting her sick mother in Portugal for 3 months. In reality, she'd been in Switzerland preparing to give birth. The baby had been handed over to Victor's sister immediately, and Isabella had returned home like nothing had happened. How could I have missed it? Richard asked Patricia one afternoon in her office. How could I have been so blind? You trusted her, Patricia said simply. That's not a weakness. That's what people do when they love someone. She exploited that trust. That's on her, not you. But it didn't make Richard feel any better. He kept replaying moments from the past 6 years looking for signs he'd missed. Times when Isabella had been distant or secretive. Trips she'd taken alone. Phone calls she'd stepped outside to take. The clues had been there. He just hadn't wanted to see them. 2 weeks after he'd come home, Richard told Isabella he needed to sign some papers for the Singapore deal. Just routine stuff, he said over breakfast. I thought we could do it here at home. More comfortable than going to the office? Of course, Isabella said, pouring herself more coffee. Whatever you need. I've asked our attorney to come by around 2. He'll bring everything we need. Richard kept his voice casual, like this was no big deal. Actually, there are some financial documents you should probably sign too. Updates to our estate planning. Isabella's eyes flickered with something. Interest, greed? It was gone so fast Richard almost missed it. Sure, I can do that. Oh, and I mentioned to your cousin that we were doing paperwork today. You know, Victor? You've talked about him helping with financial advice. I thought it might be good to have him take a look. Make sure everything's in order. I hope you don't mind that I invited him. Richard watched Isabella's face carefully. For just a moment, she went pale. Her hand trembled slightly as she set down her coffee cup. Then she recovered, forcing a smile. Victor, I didn't know you two had spoken. Just briefly. You've mentioned him so many times, I figured I should finally meet him properly. He's family, after all. Right, Isabella said. Of course. That's very thoughtful of you. But Richard could see the panic in her eyes. She excused herself, saying she needed to make a phone call. Richard watched her walk quickly to the other room, already pulling out her cell phone. He knew exactly who she was calling. At 1:30 that afternoon, Richard was in his study when the doorbell rang. He opened it to find not David Rothstein, but FBI Special Agent Robert Torres, along with 5 other federal agents. They were dressed in suits looking for all the world like lawyers and financial advisors. Mr. Chen, Agent Torres said, shaking Richard's hand. We're ready. Richard had spent the past week working with the FBI. Once Dr. Park had uncovered the extent of the fraud, David had immediately contacted federal authorities. Wire fraud, identity theft, money laundering across international borders. These weren't just civil crimes. They were federal offenses that could send Isabella and Victor to prison for decades. The agents spread throughout the house, positioning themselves strategically. Hidden cameras had been installed in the study days earlier when Isabella was out. Everything that was about to happen would be recorded, documented, preserved as evidence. At 2 o'clock, Victor arrived. He was as Richard remembered. Expensive suit, confident walk, charming smile. He shook Richard's hand like they were old friends. So good to finally meet you properly, Victor said. Isabella speaks so highly of you. Does she? Richard said. How interesting. Please come in. Make yourself comfortable. Isabella appeared, her face tight with anxiety. She kissed Victor on the cheek, and Richard saw the way her hand lingered on his arm. The familiarity between them. The secret language of 2 people who knew each other far better than they should. They all sat down in the study. The same room where Richard had overheard them 2 weeks ago. The same desk where they'd planned his destruction. Agent Torres, posing as an attorney, began spreading papers across the desk. Richard let them settle in. Let them relax. Let them think they were still in control. Then he stood up and looked at Isabella. Really looked at her. And he said the words he'd been holding inside for 2 weeks. I know everything. The room went completely silent. Isabella's face turned white as paper. Victor froze in his chair, his charming smile disappearing like someone had flipped a switch. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. What are you talking about? Isabella's voice came out shaky, uncertain. She tried to laugh, but it sounded wrong. Richard, you're scaring me. What's going on? I came home early from Singapore, Richard said quietly. 2 weeks ago. I wasn't supposed to be here, but the meeting got postponed, so I decided to surprise you. He watched the realization dawn on Isabella's face. Her eyes went wide. She glanced at Victor, then back at Richard. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. I heard everything, Richard continued. I stood outside this room and listened to you talk about draining the offshore accounts. About waiting for the Singapore deal to go through so you could take everything, about how you'd been pretending to be the perfect wife for 28 years. Victor stood up suddenly, his chair scraping against the floor. I don't know what you think you heard, but sit down, Mr. Novak. Agent Torres pulled out his badge and held it up. The other 5 people in the room did the same. FBI badges glinted in the afternoon light. Nobody's going anywhere. Victor's face went gray. He looked at the door and Richard could see him calculating his chances. 2 agents moved to block the exit before he could even try. Isabella Chen and Victor Novak, you're both under arrest, Agent Torres said. His voice was calm, professional, like he'd done this 1,000 times before. Wire fraud, identity theft, conspiracy to commit theft, and money laundering across international borders. No. Isabella stood up, shaking her head. No, this is a mistake. Richard, tell them. Tell them this is all a misunderstanding. But Richard just looked at her. This woman he'd loved for 3 decades. This stranger wearing his wife's face. Dr. Helen Park has traced every dollar you stole. $340 million across 3 years. She found all the shell corporations, all the fake signatures, all the offshore accounts. You gave me power of attorney, Isabella said, and now her voice had an edge of anger to it. You gave me access to everything. That means it's not theft. Power of attorney doesn't give you the right to steal, Agent Torres said, especially not with fraudulent documents and forged signatures. We have everything. Every email between you and Mr. Novak, every fake document, every illegal transfer. Victor suddenly lunged for the door. 2 agents grabbed him before he made it 3 steps. He struggled, shouting something in Czech, but they had him in handcuffs within seconds. His expensive suit got rumpled. His perfectly styled hair fell in his face. All his charm and confidence gone, replaced by raw panic. Richard, please. Isabella's anger crumbled into tears, real ones streaming down her face, ruining her makeup. Please, we can talk about this. Just you and me. Send these people away and let's talk. Talk? Richard felt something break inside his chest, not his heart. That had already been shattered. This was something else. The last little piece of him that had hoped maybe there was an explanation. Maybe it wasn't as bad as it seemed. You want to talk now? After 6 years of lying to my face? Isabella's tears stopped. Just for a moment, Richard saw something else in her eyes. Something cold and calculating. You were never home, she said, and her voice was different now, harder. You were always working, always traveling, always choosing your company over me. Over us, I was alone in this big house for weeks at a time. What did you expect? I expected loyalty, Richard said. I expected honesty. I expected the woman I married to actually be who she said she was. Agent Torres stepped forward with handcuffs. Mrs. Chen, I need you to put your hands behind your back. Wait, Isabella said, backing away. Wait, there's something you need to know. Richard, there's something I need to tell you. I already know about the child, Richard said, and watching her face, he almost felt sorry for her. Almost. I know about the boy in Prague. I know you're his mother. I know you hid your pregnancy and gave him to Victor's sister to raise. I know everything, Isabella. There's nothing left to tell. The blood drained from Isabella's face. She looked at Victor, who wouldn't meet her eyes. Then she looked back at Richard, and for the first time since he'd met her 30 years ago, he saw her completely without a mask. No charm, no fake warmth, just a woman who'd been caught and knew it. How long have you known? She whispered. Long enough to move all my assets somewhere you'll never find them. Richard said. That Singapore deal you were waiting for? The money hit my accounts 3 days ago. $2.3 billion, but it's not in any account you have access to. Neither is anything else. You didn't just fail to steal from me, Isabella. You lost everything you already had. She lunged at him then, screaming, trying to claw at his face. The agents grabbed her before she could reach him. She was crying and yelling, her words barely making sense. Something about how he'd ruined her life. How he'd taken the best years from her. How she deserved that money more than he did. Richard just stood there and watched her fall apart. Part of him wanted to feel satisfaction. She'd tried to destroy him and he'd won, but mostly he just felt hollow. Empty. Like someone had scooped out everything inside him and left just a shell. You really want to know why I did it? Isabella said, as the agent started to lead her toward the door. She'd stopped crying now. Her face was hard, cold, nothing like the woman he'd married. Because you loved that company more than you ever loved me. Every day, every hour, you chose work over us, over me. So I found someone who actually saw me. who actually wanted to be with me. And yes, I took your money, because I earned it. I earned every penny for putting up with you for 28 years. You had an affair, Richard said quietly. You had a child with another man. You stole hundreds of millions of dollars. And somehow in your mind you're the victim here? We're both victims, Isabella said. You were a victim of your own ambition, and I was a victim of loving someone who didn't love me back. Then the agents took her away, took them both away. Victor went quietly, his lawyer already on the phone. Isabella kept talking, kept trying to explain, kept insisting that Richard had driven her to this. Her voice faded as they led her out to the waiting cars, and then Richard was alone in his study. The same room where this had all started 2 weeks ago. The same desk where he'd seen his whole life revealed as a lie. He sat down in his leather chair and put his head in his hands. Patricia came in a few minutes later. She didn't say anything, just sat in the chair across from him and waited. I thought I'd feel better, Richard finally said. I thought when they arrested her, when justice was served, I'd feel some kind of relief. But I don't, I just feel tired. You lost your wife today, Patricia said gently. Even though she betrayed you, even though she deserved what happened, you still lost someone you loved. It's okay to grieve that. My kids, Richard said suddenly, looking up. Jennifer and Thomas. They don't know yet. How do I tell them their mother is a criminal? How do I explain that half their childhood was built on lies? Carefully, Patricia said. Honestly, and with help. I've already contacted a family therapist, someone who specializes in this kind of trauma. You're not going to get through this alone, Richard. None of you are. Richard nodded slowly. Outside he could hear the FBI cars driving away, taking Isabella to booking, to fingerprints and mugshots in a jail cell. The woman who'd slept beside him for 28 years would spend tonight behind bars, and Richard would spend it trying to figure out how to rebuild a life from the ashes of everything he'd believed in. The trial became the biggest news story of the year. Every major network covered it. Social media exploded with opinions. Strangers argued about who was right and who was wrong. Some people called Isabella a gold digger who got what she deserved. Others blamed Richard for being an absent husband. Everyone had something to say about a marriage they knew nothing about. Richard stopped reading the news after the first week. It didn't matter what strangers thought. What mattered was sitting in that courtroom day after day, listening to the evidence laid out in cold, clinical detail. Financial records, email chains, recorded conversations, the life he'd thought he was living, torn apart piece by piece for everyone to see. Isabella's lawyers tried everything. They argued she'd had permission to access the accounts. They claimed emotional distress from being married to a workaholic. They painted her as a lonely wife driven to desperate measures. But the evidence was overwhelming. The forged signatures, the shell corporations, the systematic theft over 3 years, the affair, the hidden child. The jury took less than 4 hours to reach a verdict. Guilty on all counts. Isabella showed no emotion when they read it. She just sat there in her navy blue suit, staring straight ahead like she was somewhere else entirely. The judge sentenced her to 12 years in federal prison. Victor got 15 years. His criminal history in Europe worked against him. He'd done this before in smaller ways. Isabella had just been his biggest target. When they led him away in handcuffs, he finally looked at Richard. There was no apology in his eyes, just cold calculation like he was already planning his next move for when he got out. Richard recovered most of his money. $300 million out of the $340 that had been stolen. The rest was gone, hidden so well that even Dr. Park couldn't trace it. Richard told her to stop looking. It wasn't worth the time or energy. Money was just numbers on a screen. He had plenty. What he couldn't recover was trust. The hardest part wasn't the trial. It wasn't the news coverage or the public scrutiny or even the money. The hardest part was telling his children. Jennifer was 32, a lawyer in New York with a family of her own. When Richard called to tell her, she went silent for a long moment. Then she said, "I need to come home," and hung up. She arrived the next day with her husband and their 2 kids. She didn't cry. She just looked tired. Thomas was 28, working as a doctor in Seattle. He took it differently. He got angry. Threw things. Shouted that Richard must have done something to drive their mother to this. Then he broke down crying and didn't leave his old bedroom for 2 days. They sat together in the living room, the 3 of them, and tried to make sense of it all. Richard told them everything. Every detail, every betrayal, every lie. He showed them the evidence because they asked to see it. They needed to understand this was real. I keep thinking about family dinners, Jennifer said quietly. She was holding a cup of tea but hadn't taken a single sip. All those times Mom asked us about our lives, acted interested in what we were doing. Was any of it real? Or was she just playing a role? I don't know, Richard admitted. I've asked myself the same question 1,000 times. Maybe some of it was real. Maybe she did love us in her own way. But she loved money and Victor more. Thomas put his head in his hands. What about the kid? The little boy in Prague. He's our half-brother. Does he even know we exist? Richard had thought about that too, a lot. A 3-year-old child growing up without knowing his real parents, being raised by Victor's sister, thinking she was his mother. What kind of life would that be? I've hired lawyers to look into it, Richard said. The child welfare situation. The sister raising him might not know the full truth either. It's complicated. Everything's complicated now, Jennifer said. She finally set down her tea untouched. I don't know how to feel. I'm angry at Mom, but I'm also sad for her. And I'm confused about everything I thought I knew about our family. Were we ever really happy? Or was that all fake too? Over the next few months, they all went to therapy. Together and separately. Dr. Lisa Martinez specialized in family trauma and she didn't pull punches. She made them talk about the hard things. The resentment. The confusion. The grief for a mother who was still alive but lost to them anyway. Jennifer stopped visiting Isabella in prison after the 3rd time. She still doesn't think she did anything wrong, she told Richard. She just keeps saying you drove her to it. I can't listen to that anymore. Thomas never visited at all. He was too angry, too hurt. He threw himself into his work at the hospital, pulling double shifts, avoiding anything that felt like feelings. It worried Richard, but Dr. Martinez said everyone had their own timeline for healing. Richard visited Isabella once. Just once, 6 months after the trial. He needed to see her to try to understand. She sat across from him in the prison visiting room wearing an orange jumpsuit, looking smaller somehow. Older. Tired. Why? He asked. It was the only question that mattered. After everything we built together, why did you do it? Isabella looked at him for a long moment. Because I was invisible, she finally said. You looked at me every day and didn't see me. You saw the wife role I was playing. The perfect partner for photo ops, but you never saw me. What I wanted. What I needed. Victor saw me, so you destroyed everything. I tried to take what I deserved. Her voice had an edge to it, even here, even now. 28 years, Richard. 28 years of being your accessory. Your support system. Your social coordinator. While you built an empire and got all the glory. What did I get? You got a life most people can only dream of, Richard said. You got wealth and security and freedom to do whatever you wanted. But it wasn't enough. It never would have been enough. He left after that and never went back. There was nothing more to say. Isabella would spend the next 12 years in prison, and even if she got out early for good behavior, she'd be almost 70. Her whole life reduced to a cell and regrets. Richard took a leave from his company. Patricia took over as CEO temporarily, and she ran it better than he ever had. Turned out taking a step back wasn't the disaster he'd always feared. The company didn't fall apart without him. It actually thrived. He spent 6 months at a cabin in Montana away from everything. No cell phone service. No internet. Just mountains and silence and time to think. He read books. Went hiking. Learned to cook more than just eggs and toast. Started remembering what it felt like to be a person instead of just a businessman. When he came back to California, he started a foundation. It helped families dealing with financial fraud and betrayal. He'd learned that his story wasn't unique. Thousands of people every year discovered that someone they trusted had been stealing from them. Usually it was family. Usually there were no news cameras covering it. Just quiet devastation and financial ruin. The foundation provided legal help, therapy services, financial counseling. Richard poured money into it, more than he'd spent on anything else in his life. It felt good. Like something positive could come from all this pain. A year after the trial, Richard met someone. He wasn't looking for it. Wasn't even thinking about dating. He'd gone to a lecture at Stanford about ocean conservation because Jennifer had recommended it. The speaker was a marine biologist named Claire Dawson, and she was brilliant, funny, passionate about saving coral reefs and sea turtles. After the lecture, he introduced himself. She had no idea who he was, didn't follow tech news or business headlines. She just knew he was interested in ocean conservation, and that was enough to get coffee. Their first real date was at a food truck. Claire insisted. Said fancy restaurants made her uncomfortable. They sat on a bench eating tacos and talking about everything except his past. She told him about her research about diving in the Great Barrier Reef, about the beauty of the underwater world. On their third date, he told her about Isabella, everything. He figured if she was going to run, better to know now. But Claire didn't run. She listened. Then she told him about her ex-husband, a gambling addict who'd lost their house and their savings before disappearing one night. She understood betrayal. She understood having to rebuild from nothing. The thing about rock bottom, Claire said, is that it's solid ground. You can build on it. Something real this time. They took it slow, very slow. Richard wasn't ready to trust easily, and Claire respected that. They dated for 2 years before she moved into his new house, not the mansion in Atherton. He'd sold that place immediately. Too many ghosts. Instead, he bought a smaller home overlooking the ocean in Carmel. 4 bedrooms, nothing fancy, with a view of the Pacific. Jennifer and Thomas both came to the wedding. Small ceremony, just close family and friends. Jennifer's kids were flower girl and ring bearer. Thomas walked Claire down the aisle because her father had passed away years before. It felt right, like they were building something new together. A different kind of family. Richard never fully trusted the same way he had before. There was always a small part of him that held back, that waited for the other shoe to drop. Dr. Martinez said that was normal, that he might always carry that scar. But he learned to live with it. To accept that trust didn't mean being blind. It meant being open with your eyes wide awake. On quiet mornings, sitting on his deck with Claire, watching the sun rise over the ocean, Richard thought about that October afternoon when he'd come home early. The moment that changed everything. Part of him wished it had never happened, that he could have lived in ignorant happiness forever. But most of him knew the truth was better. Painful but better, because now when Claire said she loved him, when Jennifer called to chat, when Thomas stopped by for Sunday dinner, Richard knew it was real. Not perfect, not without complications, but real, and after everything he'd been through, real was enough.